Today I'm talking with rogue integral philosopher, political theorist, and my friend Steve McIntosh. Like me, he's got a strong patriotic streak, a love of what we might call God, a deep passion for cultural evolution, and a dedication to keep exploring, refining, and challenging his own ideas. Around the end of last year, Steve sent me a pre-published copy of his recent book, Developmental Politics. And what we're going to do today is sort of sidestep a lot of the stuff you might ordinarily get asked about that book. We're going to touch a little bit on the political vision, but basically we're going to try to focus on the second half of the book where Steve advances his speculative philosophy of values and value energy and the evolution of the good. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Layman. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So why don't you give us an overview of what the vision is and what you'd like to talk about?
Sure. Well, the idea of developmental politics is summarized by the subtitle of the book, How America Can Grow into a Better Version of Itself. And the first half of the book is designed to be accessible, pragmatic, and addressing how we can create political evolution in realistic terms within the current context of our civilization at this moment. The book focuses primarily on America because I am American, but also because to talk about politics, there's not, global politics is a sort of a different subject, right? If we're talking about domestic politics, it's contained within a nation state for the most part. However, much of what we'll be talking about applies not just to obviously American politics, which are particularly challenging at the moment, but also to the politics of the developed world, right? Wherever you have the progressive postmodern worldview emerging from modernity, these dynamics are in play. And so that's just a precursor. I've got 5 basic topics in the material I'd like to cover with you. And these are primarily from chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the book, right? Part 1 of the book is called Toward a New Political Philosophy, right? And then the second part of the book is more philosophical itself. So it's a political philosophy book, but in the realm of activism. So what I want to cover, I want to talk a little bit about how the current context, right? So this is late June, early July, the sort of the context that we're talking about. And we've had significant protests, not only in America, but all over the developed world about the tragic murder of George Floyd, right? And the awakening, the sort of second, third, fourth, whatever it is, significant social awakening to the need for racial equality, right? So how that's a major problem that we can no longer tolerate racism in the United States. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that context and how what we're about to talk about on these more philosophical areas relates to that. Then I want to bring in the concept of value energy, right? Which is related to this idea of eros, but a little bit different in the sense that the idea is that we can begin to understand things that are valuable, things that attract our attention, things that motivate us to make things better. We can understand that as a kind of internal energy, right? And then this may sound esoteric, but as I hope to show, it does get practical fast. Then I want to move to the idea of how once we are working with the theoretical concept of value as a flow of energy or as a magnetic pull on consciousness, this leads to the idea of self-interest and greater than self-interest, right? And there's the sources of human motivation, what's pulling us. And there I'll argue that the self-interest and greater than self-interest cohere as an interdependent polarity, whereby, in order to self-actualize, we've got to serve something greater than ourselves, but to serve something greater than ourselves, there also has to be something in it for us, so to speak. And how that polarity is relevant to understanding the pull of transcendence, right? This idea that a better world is possible, and that pull is certainly evident in many of the protests and the social unrest that we see now. Then I want to talk about the idea of each major worldview is its own kind of channel for the upward current of transcendence, right? Each major worldview defines the horizon of improvement in its own way, and therefore acts as a channel for this energy, that attracts people and gives them identity. And then finally, the fifth thing I want to talk about are how cultural evolution as a form of transcendence, but how can we make the world a better place? Well, there's myriad ways, but certainly evolving consciousness and culture is one of the ways we can do that. and how we might approach that as a political project. Why it's not just some idealistic vision that doesn't reach all the way down to the ground. I want to talk about the 3 different strategies that I outline in the book for approaching cultural evolution, not only as a political project, but as an ideal of transcendence that can animate, a new and emergent worldview that you and I are about. So that's kind of the overview perspective. And let me kind of let you jump in if you have any questions or comments here at the beginning.
Well, that all sounds fine. I'm ready to leap right into the nuances of esoteric philosophy, but why don't you go ahead and, ground it in what you see as the political urgency of the moment.
Okay, sure. Well, the main thing to talk about is that for people who were not entirely familiar with this integral philosophy, one element of it is this understanding of worldview development, how consciousness is evolving, and it's evolving on many lines. In some ways it's a sprawling bush, but in other ways there's some structure there, right? So there's no development that lacks a structure, right? And so again, there's many different structures. Each line is its own structure. However, what we can begin to see clearly is that values or worldviews cohere in these intersubjective systems. And intersubjective is this idea that in between the subjective consciousness of our interior psychology and the objective world of things is this realm of culture that's internal but not entirely subjective, right? It's in between the objective world of physical things and the subjective world of psychology. Both contribute, both interpenetrate, but that intersubjectivity is its own ontological realm. Right, that's one of the greatest things of Wilber's quadrant model, from my perspective, is this sort of diagramming of ontological intersubjectivity. Right, intersubjectivity being real, and in that space between us, in this cultural domain of development, we have these worldviews, and the pattern that they exhibit is a dialectical pattern of transcendence and inclusion. Right, so there's a worldview, and then a new worldview emerges, and those worldviews are in a kind of a tension, a dialectical tension, and then that tension is eventually resolved with a third worldview, and it sort of continues. And this dialectical pattern of transcending and including and transcending and including is really, it marks the structure of evolutionary emergence from the beginning of the Big Bang, right? We see it in the behavior of atoms and molecules, and in the reproductive behavior of life, and in human awareness and human striving. The dialectic is its own philosophical subject we could spend an entire podcast unpacking, I'm sure. But nevertheless, these worldviews, according to integral philosophy, are not just convenient constructs, analytical categories. They're actually systems. They cohere through time, and the systemicity of these worldview structures is made up of agreements, right? Each little agreement forms a kind of a mini system, just like cells form the body of an organism. Agreements about words, agreements about values, agreements about things that matter, cohere into these larger systemic structures. And the 3 major structures, there's more, right? Goes all the way down, and according to some, there's a giant ontology of future structures waiting for us to grow into, and I certainly believe that. How far we can chart those structures is, yet another podcast. But the 3 main worldviews that are at play, perhaps 4 or 5, the 3 major ones that people will be familiar with are the traditional religious worldview, the mainstream worldview of modernity, modernism, and then this progressive worldview, the progressive postmodern worldview. So right now in America, the rough demographic estimates are modernity, modernism, the mainstream striving and scientific rational worldview. That's about 50% of the population, more or less. I mean, people are not types, but they do have a center of gravity, right? So we can kind of make orienting generalizations about centers of gravity. And the center of gravity of American culture in general is still within modernity. And then we have this worldview of religious traditionalism. As I mentioned, it's about 30%. Still evangelical Christians by themselves make up 25% of the American population. So there's plenty of other traditionalists in that category as well. And then this third one that's emerged over the last 50 years and is still in the process of emerging is the progressive postmodern worldview. Let's call it progressivism. so people kind of understand what we're talking about. Because, we've been calling it postmodernism. That's the sort of the main lingo that most of us use. But I think postmodernism is confusing for people because they think of it as critical theory by itself, as opposed to this larger worldview, which contains many elements. So anyway, we can spend our entire time defining and reflecting on how these worldviews overlap and how they're separate and how they form a structure, et cetera. But what we can see right now in the current unrest is that there's been an acceleration of a larger historical process that's been going on for at least 50 years and maybe for 150 years. And that is that the worldview of modernity, the mainstream worldview of modernity, the moral system which it needs, the moral system which it sort of depends upon, is being transferred from the traditional moral system which supplied the morality of modernity since its beginning, to this progressive moral system which offers an alternative moral system, right? That's why many conservative commentators talk about progressivism as a new religion. It's not a new religion, but it is a new moral system. And the idea is that one of the characteristics of this larger pattern, right, of the dialectical structure of worldviews, is that we see a general oscillation between worldviews that are communitarian-oriented, worldviews that are about the sacrifice of the self for the group, and then individualistic worldviews that are about the expression of the self, right? And then there's a bit of a dialectical pattern. Again, each worldview contains both self-orientation and group orientation, but I think it's a pretty clear observation from history that traditionalism is about the group, and it has, both positives and negatives associated with that orientation or that ethos of communitarianism. Modernity makes its advance because it liberates the individual. It's very much about individual rights and the sovereignty of the individual and the sort of escape of the oppression of the group. So modernity, but because modernity has an individualistic ethos, it relies on and depends on an accompanying communitarian worldview to supply the social norms and the sort of the morality. So modernity has its own morality, but that morality is not freestanding. It needs a moral system to go with it. And so even though modernity emerged from traditionalism, right, in the Enlightenment, it still had a kind of a cultural truce with traditionalism. As long as it didn't try to rule politics, it could supply the morality of modernity throughout most of its history. And we see this truce reach its kind of culmination in the post-war period, from 1945 until about 1964, 68, right? In that range, there was this sort of well-established social agreement about traditional morality being what everybody was about, except for radical artists and intellectuals, right? But then in the 60s, this progressive worldview emerges, partially as a result of traditionalism becoming outmoded and increasingly discredited by scientific advances, and partially because modernity itself, the truce, the cultural truce between modernity and traditionalism, the pathologies of that, the crimes of that Western world became more and more obvious. And this larger moral impulse to make the world better, which affects every generation, but some generations more acutely than others, motivated and animated the baby boomer generation to discover and embrace an alternative moral system, a communitarian moral system that was in a dialectical separation from modernity. But now that it's been 50 or more years that progressivism has been gaining ground. I mean, it's certainly not just warmed over 60s culture. It's got its own, the counterculture has become a kind of counter-establishment. And increasingly, the tug of war between traditionalism and progressivism, these two competing moral systems for the soul of modernity in the middle, right? That's the source of the culture war. And that's why modernity, we can see a left and a right, whereas most of the people in the traditional worldview are on the right, and most of the people in the progressive worldview are on the left, right? Even though we can identify, left-wing traditionalists and maybe right-wing progressives, it's sort of an oxymoron. So we see this historical, multi-generational tug of war, and progressivism, I mean, certainly traditionalism has its own sacred tenets, Christianity being the most alive within Western civilization, but there's certainly other traditional systems that contribute. Progressivism, to simplify it, has three major sacred causes which animate it and which are sort of the anchor points of its moral system, right? The first one, or maybe the last one, is environmental sustainability, right? And which is focused on overcoming global warming and the threat to the world that poses. The other one is gender equality, right? And we see that sacred cause in, for example, in the Me Too movement and in feminism in general. And then the third one is racial equality, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. Although progressivism as a worldview has other forms of transcendence or sacred causes or higher purposes that it's attracted to or is trying to advance, but these three are kind of the cornerstones of that moral system. And so a lot of the moral focus of progressivism is concerned with righting the wrongs of Western civilization, right? Even though many of those wrongs have been caused by traditional consciousness, ethnocentric consciousness, modernity is a senior partner in that truce, and so modernity kind of rightly takes the blame, right? So certainly modernity is responsible for environmental degradation, but sexism and racism are in some ways legacies of ethnocentrism and other forms of the negative externalities of traditionalism. Nevertheless, what we've seen in the past few weeks after the murder of George Floyd is progressivism finding its traction in the culture with this kind of sacred cause of overcoming racism. And that's a sacred cause that gains, it seems to be at the moment, it's a lot more politically powerful than the other two sacred causes, right? Environmentalism being very tough to sell, right? I mean, some people are adamant, of course, within progressivism, and many modernists and even some traditionalists agree with that sacred cause. But we don't see millions of people marching in the streets over climate change like we do over racism. Likewise, sexism, we saw the Women's March, we've seen Me Too, but that as a sacred cause also has its limitations as a political force. But racism is certainly a problem that we needed to tackle. And so we see this intense channeling of political will, which is accelerating progressivism's power within the culture. This larger historical course of progressivism gradually replacing traditionalism as the moral system that supplies the morality and the social norms for modernity. We've seen an acceleration of that. And part of that is from Trump, of course. Trump has accelerated history for both good and bad. As I argue in the book, in Developmental Politics, Trump has Trump's appeal, Trump's election was as a result of a pushback against the growing cultural threat of progressivism. But yet Trump in office has exacerbated the perceived problems and the real problems of modernity and has been a boon to progressivism, right? So progressivism has been winning the culture war for a long time, but it's been, at least with Trump, defeated temporarily politically. And so Trump's rise has incited and exacerbated and energized progressivism, and the pandemic, everybody being kept home, acted as a compressor of a lot of energy. And so this larger historical trend of Americans and people all over the world wanting to embrace the righteousness of progressivism has sort of sprung out and caused lots of turmoil. And I think in general that progressivism is the sort of the most evolved large-scale form of culture that's yet to appear in the timeline of human history. But like all of these worldviews, it has positives and negatives. And as it accelerates, as it gains ground culturally and hopefully eventually politically to some degree, the pathologies of progressivism are exposed. We can begin to see the pathologies of it, the destructive nature of it, the craziness, the totalitarianism of it. more clearly than ever before. So the cultural threat is bright now, whereas before it could be sort of dismissed. And this is accelerating history in another way. I don't want to call it a backlash. I mean, certainly modernity has a right to defend itself culturally and politically. And to the extent that many forces within progressivism would, given the chance, tear down modernity and eliminate it, there's some healthy conflict going on, which will hopefully lead to further evolution, right? And whether it does is partially dependent upon whether we can formulate and agree on a political philosophy that is that can get its arms around our time, that can get our arms around this fast accelerating cultural evolution that we're witnessing, because most of political philosophy today is either modernist, right, in the realm of Rawls and the economists. There's sort of a blending of political philosophy and economics. And then, of course, we have postmodern political philosophy, which is very radical, kind of deconstructionist, very, it's sort of the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? And it has some valid observations about the pathologies of the world and modernity, of course. But in this mode of the dialectic, it's very much an antithesis. It's sort of gaining traction by its own, character of protest and rejection, right? Which is a necessary step to hopefully a larger synthesis that can better include and make peace between these major worldviews. Because, traditionalism is not just going to go away, even though it loses its grip of moral authority on modernity.
Okay, so we're looking at creating in the United States a political will that can mobilize people who are traditional and modern and progressive in alignment with the general moral framework of healthy progressivism. Sure.
The reason that I'm rehearsing this overview of the current situation is I want to emphasize political will is under-theorized and misunderstood, right? At least there's a lot of psychological theorizing around personal will, personal motivation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But why political will is generated in some circumstances but not others. Why there's strong political will for anti-racism but not the same level of political will for environmental sustainability, those are good questions that this philosophy attempts to answer.
And it's interesting to try to theorize that by way of analogy to physical energy. That to me is a neat attempt. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what people like Nietzsche were looking at. Like, what is the subjective analogy to physical energy? And how does that turn into will in the individual, but also maybe in the collective? And one of the things I'm wondering about is there an analogy to different ages and epochs of physics in terms of trying to theorize value energy? Because you could argue that the kind of dominant physical analogy would be Newtonian mechanics in a way. A lot of the way we think about value and mobilizing people, political will even, is with a kind of push-pull dynamic, right? That either people are stressed or they see something terrible, which in a way the George Floyd thing is, right? You see a negative, there's a pressure there, or you have an opportunity, an enticement, a shining ideal to move toward. All right, and these pressures move people around. So even if you aren't that happy with Joe Biden, you might think Trump is so obscene that it's enough pressure to move you around. And there's a kind of tactical, political strategist, marketing sensibility of providing a positive and negative movement. But if that is sort of an early modernist mechanics version of how value energy works, what's the correlate to an Einsteinian revolution? What's the correlate to a quantum mechanics of value energy? How do you think about that kind of stuff?
Sure. Well, first of all, that's an excellent question. And let me at least explain for the listeners what the hell we're talking about regarding value energy, and then we'll get to that important opening. So I start with the idea of Ralph Waldo Emerson's insight that every natural fact is a symbol of some higher spiritual fact. That the physical behaviors of the world, and the biological world and the cultural world, that what we can see or maybe I should say the social world, but things that are in this objective domain, right? The physical world that we can see, that those are in some ways, those are they have behaviors and characteristics that are a shadow of some larger domain that human senses can't always appreciate. So taking off from that idea, we ask what is it? What is value? Right? This has been a major quest for philosophy since before Plato, but for many thousands of years, Plato's explanation of value as the eternal forms, the beautiful, the true, and the good, as these sort of objective, static forms that were calling us, that the physical world reproduced those forms imperfectly, but to the extent that they mirrored those forms, that they were attractive to us. That idea held sway and was refined further, through the centuries. But then with the Enlightenment, there was this huge questioning of that idea, the idea that value is somehow objective, because you couldn't point to it, right? Where was this thing called value? If we're getting empirical, value seems to disappear. And so then it was posited that value is essentially subjective, right? That value is just whatever your preference is. It's generated by your mind, and that there's no value in the world. That we're not finding things that are valuable. We're just making value by projecting our preferences, which are in some ways programmed by our evolutionary psychology. Right? So that was sort of collapsing value into the subjective realm. But just like objective notions of value were sort of overthrown philosophically, the idea that value is just in your head, that likewise has sort of shown to be partial, at least. Certainly, we're the subjective observer is necessary to have a value experience, but it isn't as if the world has no value in it until we come along and see it, right? So even all forms of life have a sense of value, because all forms of life are striving to survive and reproduce, and that value isn't contained entirely with the striving organism, right? Like the quote that the ordinary person, unless corrupted by philosophy, doesn't believe that he just makes value by his choices. He believes that some things really are better than others, and he's capable of getting it wrong. So, value is neither entirely internal nor entirely external. It connects the value of the world with the value in us, and the way that I found that illuminates this process and makes this slippery concept of we're both making and finding value. What brings that together is that value is not so much a thing. The things don't possess value as much as value is the phenomenon of the universe evolving toward greater completion, toward greater perfection. So value is a direction of advance. And while all life can advance in that direction, with the emergence of humanity and human consciousness, the horizon of potential values, the horizon of potential advance and the improvement of the human condition becomes unlimited, right? So the improvement of the animal condition is sort of dependent upon the ecosystem and the animal's needs, but human needs, human aspirations can never be fulfilled, because as soon as we satisfy one set of needs, we awaken to a higher set of needs. And this is not only illustrated theoretically by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, with which most people are familiar, but we can also see it in the large-scale intersubjective structures of history, which roughly recapitulate the hierarchy of needs. But that's another subject. But understanding value as a movement, as a direction, begins to illuminate why this idea of energy is so powerful. Because we can begin to think of it as a current, right? So energy itself, the electromagnetic spectrum, is still relatively recent in human conception, right? Even though humans have seen fire and lightning and sunshine and all these forms of energy, from the beginning, it really wasn't until the beginning of the 19th century that the concept of energy was used in its modern sense, and it wasn't until the 1850s that there began to be Newtonian, philosophical or mathematical, scientific equations, like Maxwell's equations, began to show that magnetism and electricity were part of this same spectrum of energy. And so the physics, if you will, or the kind of the behaviors of value, if it's not just a convenient analogy, but there's actually something to this upward current of energy in the intersubjective realm, the equivalent of physical energy. Just like in biological systems, there's a throughput, right? Every system has a metabolism, right? It takes in food and sunlight, and it has this metabolism of energy. That's how it maintains its systemic vitality in the face of entropy. Well, again, if we're trying to see an analogy across from the internal to the external universes, we can begin to see, wow, that really does help explain the metabolism of these internal intersubjective structures, right? So if ontological intersubjectivity is a real realm, if these worldviews really do have their own independent freestanding systemicity, then we would expect to find some kind of metabolism, right? Some kind of throughput that's driving the systemic integrity in the face of decay and entropy. Even though we may not have entropy in the internal universe, there may be something equivalent of just boredom or lack of interest. So it starts to get exciting for me, at least, when we begin to see, wow, this analogy of the internal equivalent of energy, both for psychological energy, psychic energy, human motivation, and for these larger structures, these worldviews, these containers of political will and human aspiration, that they're actually metabolizing a current. And this current is what I describe as the upward current of the good. I argue for this at some detail in the book. In a podcast, it's hard to land it, or it sort of get in the weeds quickly if I try to make every argument that I use to support that analogy. But let me just say that this idea that the world can be better, that we have a vision for a better way, that we have an ideal of the good life, that we have achieved perhaps to some degree, but there's more. And even when we achieve the good life as our worldview defines it, we're still not completely satisfied. There's still that emptiness for more. So this is part of the intrinsic nature of the human condition, is that we're led to something higher, even though we don't quite know what that higher is, and we're kind of groping our way, and we keep redefining what higher means. We keep improving our definition of improvement itself. And so this idea is exciting because it begins to show us how we might better understand what political will is, and how we might be able to more intentionally create it, or when it's going off track, how we might dampen it, or channel what otherwise might be a moral panic into something that creates positive moral evolution, right? It's because, when things start moving fast, things start getting broken, right? As we can see, with the riots being part of the protests. But, that's this whole subject too.
So one of the things I noticed about the book was a little shift in your thinking in terms of primarily regarding value as gravitation toward thinking of it as magnetism.
Sure. Well, in evolution,
that's interesting to me in terms of the physics, because when you come at it from the angle of gravity, for example, right? The idea would be that the larger and denser the thing, the more it's sloping the universe in its direction, giving the impression of a flow of energy. But if you look at it from the magnetism direction, every electron has a magnetic field, right? Every electromagnetism, I always think like maybe attractive luminosity is a way of saying electromagnetism, right? And the reason things aren't magnetic is because those fields disagree with each other in general. But if you line them all up, then you have a magnetic substance.
Sure.
So that's really intriguing.
That's a fascinating.
Think of that sloping of the universe toward value, or of the production of this value energy by a resonant alignment of parts.
Right. Well, okay. So let's get to that and how far we can push the analogy, and there's lots more to discover, right? But just a little bit of background. Plato, of course, talked about this idea of eros, and he compared it to libidinous desire. The desire we have for the beauty of another person's sexuality, that translates as the mind develops into kind of an eros for the beautiful things of the world that go beyond any kind of sexual reproduction. But just like Plato's objective theory of value was shown to be philosophically problematic, this idea of eros, I'm not a Platonic scholar, but I'm not sure how there was a separation between, the eros that's coming from within, right? The natural attraction that we're generating ourselves, and versus the external pull of something outside of us, right? But I tried to unpack this idea of eros and make it, add to the philosophy of eros, and I know Wilber talks about eros in his own way too, by positing the idea of value gravity. And this was in my 2012 book, Evolution's Purpose. And I was using it as a very rough analogy, just just to emphasize that it's not all internally generated. There's something out there. This upward current that we're talking about goes from within to without, and it's moving towards something better in the outer world, not just a better inner condition, because the conditions of the outer world are interpenetrate with the inner conditions. So, but then in thinking about this over some years in the 2020 book, Developmental Politics, I still think the analogy of gravity is useful, but I think a little bit more accurate analogy is the electromagnetic spectrum, because the electromagnetic spectrum, we can see how its behaviors include moving between poles, right, between the positive and negative poles, and it's kind of a flow, and so that started to get exciting. Now, one thing it's important to be careful of is that I'm not claiming that everything that we can think of in the Newtonian physics of energy, and then up through the quantum physics and the much more elaborate and mysterious physics that we're beginning to discover now, that there's a one-to-one correlation, that there may be, but it's a little bit like, Ben Franklin with a kite and the key, like, look, there's this lightning and we can get it in a jar. I mean, that's where we are with understanding value energy, is that we're very, at least if this is a thing and it grows and starts to prove, and not just as a fruitful analogy, but something that can help us get at the physics of energy. If we take if we take Emerson's insight about the natural facts and the spiritual facts as a guide, then we can expect that quantum physics also illuminates the behaviors of value in some very interesting ways. But I think that it's going to take a lot of people thinking about this for a long time and challenging the idea and experimenting with what works in terms of what generates political will and what doesn't, so we can see whether the analogy goes all the way down to electrons, and whether quantum physics adds another layer of analogical understanding to human motivation. So I don't want to claim too many things, and I think it's worth speculating about. And certainly there's more to it than Newtonian physics, but we've got to start somewhere, right? We're still, the kite is still trying to find the lightning, and so at least we can say, look, value is behaving as a current. It has a magnetism, and there's this polar effect, which I'm going to get to in my next section. But I just think I keep finding ways that this way of thinking applies and brings power and light to our political circumstances. So I think it has a lot of promise and needs to be further developed.
I agree. I think it's a very provocative way to think about value. You mentioned Plato a minute ago, and when I'm thinking of, I think it's in the Symposium, Socrates describes this process whereby very specific instances of attraction can be refined to greater and more abstract and more intense degrees of attraction. Now, one of the things that interests me about that is they're sort of saying that you have a capacity to experience value that you can improve upon, because value may be out there in some form, or it may be as part of our adaptive co-grip with reality or something like that. And we have these different kinds of values that different worldviews present and different individuals present. But what do you think about the idea that individuals vary in their capacity to experience and enact value, and that's a really important piece of this? Because even if they had the right value structure and the right ideas of value, they might not really be very good at either experiencing or acting on it.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the more interesting sociological surveys to come out in the last few years is this Hidden Tribes report, where they did sociology, define what people's political motivations were, and they found a significant portion of the American electorate were what they call disengaged, They weren't interested in politics. They didn't watch the news. They didn't care. They were just in their own little world. And at least on the political front, I mean, maybe they love their children, or they're engaged with other forms of value that don't involve social structures and politics. But I think definitely that some people are alive with value, that they're so energized by it that sometimes they become fanatical, right? They're too energized by it, right? And other people are mildly energized. A lot of it has to do with your fellows, the people around you. The more that they're on fire with the value, the more you feel compelled. That's sort of when your friends are out protesting on the street, you feel an obligation to be with them. I mean, there's some interesting social science around how movements are formed based on this sense of tribal obligation or fellowship with those who you care about. And that when you feel that a value is affecting your group, your people, you're much more able to be attracted by that value or motivated by it. And we see that both in righteous political movements and in silly fads, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people they hook into value because they see other people doing it, right? And that's another under-theorized element of how movements form and political will is generated. But I definitely think that just like, if you're an athlete, like, I like to ride my bicycle, my road bike, and for fitness. And I find that if I ride every day, it's much easier to ride. The next day, the inertia of I'm lazy or I'm tired or it's too cold or whatever, that there's a momentum to it. And I think the same thing is true, not just with physical strength, but with the strength of conviction that comes from dedication to a value. And that's a perfect lead into my next section, unless you want to talk about anything else on this one.
Well, one thing I would note is how well the idea of value as a current plays into the studies on flow, right? And flow is very interesting in terms of political will because, like you say in this hidden tribes thing, there are a lot of people who are disengaged, right? Maybe the biggest voting segment of Americans are non-voters. So how do you relate that when those same people who won't vote will stand in line for hours and pay for the right to play a game or watch a musician or watch a film, right? Because those structures incite a certain group flow state, and a lot of the political situation doesn't incite a flow state. So what do you think is the relationship between flow and political will?
Well, the honest answer is I'm not sure. I've read Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the guy who wrote the book Flow.
Good pronunciation.
That's a kind of a secularized description of this ancient Taoist and Zen idea of Wu Wei, right? How there's this kind of flow of the Tao, and if you get out of the way, it will flow through you, right? And so he talks about that in secular psychological terms and relates it to athletics, but also talks about a flow state that you get in when you're writing or you're doing anything that absorbs you in a way that you are no longer there. You're just completely one with whatever you're doing. So I think that there's certainly some connections with this idea of value as a current, the Tao even as a current. I think that's kind of one of the best explanations of what the understanding of the Tao is. That's the flow of the Tao. I don't have a pithy or satisfying explanation about why some people are turned on by video games and other people are turned on by overcoming racism. I think there's certainly a lot of overlap. There's certainly plenty of gamers out there protesting on the streets. But at the same time, that is, whether people can be connected with the horizon of improvement, that is the definition of their worldview, the good life at its most spiritually self-actualizing level, right, as defined by these worldviews, it depends on the strength of the worldview. It depends on the strength of that person's connection to the worldview, which depends on their social context, like were their family really into these things or were their family disengaged, right? If they've never learned from anybody, if they've never seen anybody that knows them or that they care about get lit up by a commitment to the highest forms of value that worldview can define, then they may just not be able to channel that current. They may be distracted by entertainment or by more trivial pursuits because they don't know that their real happiness, their real self-actualization, their real eudaimonia is going to be largely connected to how far they can go on this larger spectrum of value, which in turn is defined by the worldview that they find themselves in.
That's neat that they might not know, right? Like, to what degree do you think people who articulate their values, like, are people in general good indicators of what their values are? Because if you phone them up and ask them what they think about political issues, they might tell you one thing, but their behavior might tell you something else.
Sure. Well, I mean, what are you passionate about? I mean, lots of people don't have any passion, right? That's why this sort of self-help bromide that you should follow your passion is sometimes cruel, because people say I should follow my bliss or follow my passion, but I don't have anything I'm passionate about. That's why, and there's some good advice, if you want to find passion, start with what you're curious about. So, some people, if they're able to go fully into the path, maybe they are curious about video games. I mean, just to use this analogy, they're curious about video games. They start to play, they like it, and they get so into it that they become, video game athletes, or that becomes their secular career. And then maybe that connects them to some political issues, right? We see, the negative current, which I'll talk about in Gamergate, for example, right? How that the people who were interested in value and interested in video games, they were attracted by a downward current, of negative culture that in some ways we could see that maybe as an eddy. This is all highly speculative. I'm just, off the cuff thinking about this, but how we can engage people to care about true transcendence and not be distracted with status or material or entertainment. That's one of the major political issues of our time. We want to align people to get behind environmental sustainability, right? We want planetary healing. We don't want them to be distracted by video games or status seeking. And that's one of the directions of evolution, one of the opportunities we have to energize our culture to create more unity, not just for social peace, but also for social progress. So, it connects up to the movement for a better world quite quickly if we allow ourselves to think about it as an upward current that we can potentially, encircuit more people with, right? Or maybe it's like, when the electric light, right, was first invented, there were only a few places that had it, but eventually the whole country got lit up, right? And maybe we can see something similar with forms of transcendence in the future.
Okay. I've been sort of covering a couple areas where I think this idea of value energy could go forward. But where would you like to go next on this?
Well, okay, so Chapter 5 of Developmental Politics, I introduced this idea of value energy and connected up with, I think, the key insight of integral philosophy and other philosophies, which is that consciousness evolves. And consciousness evolves not just by itself, but in connection with cultural evolution, that consciousness and culture co-evolve, and that one ultimately depends on the other, can only go so far without the other. And that this idea of evolving culture leads to how does culture evolve, the internal part, the intersubjective part, there's value energy, and then there's a metabolism and upward currents that can be tapped into, but those can only have to be contained within a worldview so that current can be channeled to connect all the way down to the ground to a historical horizon of improvement, because we can't just we can't achieve a utopian enlightenment in one step. We have to get there by dialectical steps. So then in Chapter 6, I bring in this idea of the current idea in connection with poles. So in the first part of the book, I introduced this idea of Polarity Theory, which has now become a fruitful addition to integral philosophy. Right, Wilbur talks about it a little bit, but its more robust expressions are just coming in now. And I think the idea of polarity theory is very practical and very useful for understanding just the dynamics between worldviews. And polarity theory is been well developed. It comes primarily out of business academia, right? So we could trace it back, of course, to Heraclitus and Lao Tzu. The yin and yang is in some ways an expression of polarity theory, how these opposites, and that at the center of one is the other. And that's, that we also see that in Nicholas of Cusa in the Middle Ages. He called it the coincidence of opposites. So this understanding the philosophical significance of the interplay of polarities is ancient. But polarity theory, as it in its modern day expression, and it's now being applied by organizational development consultants and management workers, it brings in a new element, because it's not just yin and yang. Yin and yang, the Taoist conception of yin and yang, are sort of opposites seeking harmony. It's kind of a little bit like male and female, right? Like they both have their complementarity, but they're essential equals seeking harmony. And that's certainly a phase or an element of polarity theory that's important. But there's another element that we're beginning to discover, and what makes the application of polarity theory so useful in business is that there's also a motif of part and whole. That the polarity theory is not just equal seeking equipoise, but a dynamic upward structure whereby the part and the whole have their own impetus, right? The whole, in any situation, in abstract terms, the whole is seeking integration, right? It's seeking to bring things together into a unified, harmonious whole. But the part is seeking differentiation. It's seeking to break out of the static container of any given whole at any time in history and find something new. So this dynamic of the whole integrating and the part differentiating is, again, another model of this dialectical process of evolution that we talk about at the beginning of our talk here. And so polarity theory, the idea is that there are many opposites in the world, right? Up and down, poverty and prosperity. We could talk about, in a very banal and mundane way, the fact that, oh yeah, everything is opposites, hot and cold, big deal. But where this gets interesting is that there are certain kinds of opposition, especially with values and things that create value, that produce a dynamic system such that the advance of one side of this polar pair depends on the challenge and support of its opposite, right? So this isn't hot and cold. It isn't night and day. It's liberty and equality, or real and ideal, right? There's so many different polarities we could talk about that are these abstract but very important pairs. So liberty and equality is a really good one to talk about, because it shows how the advance of one depends on the moderating influence of the other, right? So if we just go for individual liberty by itself, then we get gross inequality, right? And so we see in the political spectrum, libertarianism is very much a champion of the individualistic pole of liberty, right? And it's inevitable that there are people who are going to be champions of liberty to the exclusion of equality. We see this pathology of one-sideism, we might call it, where there's a misunderstanding regarding how the value that they're trying to create, the value that they're staking their flag in, is ultimately in relationship to this other value, right? So those who want to tear down all hierarchies and create not just equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome, right, by management from above, that's a kind of one-sideism on equality. It doesn't realize that's going to be pathological. When you have an interdependent polarity, while one side can maximize its value-creating potential by being in relation to the other side, by being in this relationship of both challenge and support, as I mentioned, another fact about polarity theory is that when you have these value poles, when one becomes disconnected from the other, it can have its own version of pathology. So liberty without any notion of equality can become pathological, and vice versa. We can say the same thing about the real and the ideal, right? Or something more mundane like candor and diplomacy, right? If you're only diplomatic, then you become kind of two-faced and duplicitous, right? But if you only have candor, then you're an asshole, and people are not going to listen to you, right? So you need both. They need to be informed by each other to maximize the value of each. And while in some ways that's obvious, in other ways it's not. There's some theoretical subtleties that go with that, and there's even a method whereby you create a chart, and this is one of the management tools. If you have, so for example, in business, you might have marketing and accounting. There's a value polarity, right? Or we could make it more abstract and say in every business, and maybe in every organization, you have builders and protectors, and you need both. You need people who are building the organization, like the salespeople, and people who are protecting the organization and keeping track of its, integrity, like the accounting people. And if you're in business and you let the accounting people run the show, then your business is going to be, in trouble. Likewise, if you just let the salespeople go and there's no accounting and there's no reconciling of whether things are profitable or sustainable, that can be pathological. But when the both are working together and building and protecting, in an integrated way, then you have a healthy organization. So polarity theory, there involves these charts, like I said. So you have the two positives, but each positive has a negative that goes with it. So you make a 4-quadrant, not Wilber's 4 quadrants, but just a cross, and you have the positives on the upside and the negatives on the downside. And you can see the downward diagonal comparisons in the chart show in many polarities how the upsides of one are the remedy for the downsides of the other. And that's how you get this relationship of challenge and support. That because each one's upsides needs to be constantly pruned, its downsides need to be constantly kept in check or it falls to its pathology. And that's why this polarity can form as an iterative system, like two legs. It's not as if we're just trying to create a static equipoise. We're trying to create a dynamic interplay, a recursive, iterative process whereby the value of each side of these value polarities is advancing by turns, right? So I introduced polarity theory, as an introductory section in part 1 of the book. But then in part 2, I apply it to this idea of human motivation and with an eye toward political will. Right? That's what we want. We want to improve the flow and we want to improve our ability to generate political will. Right? So the only way that humans could generate energy was to build a fire. Right? And then they figured out steam engines and then electricity. And so likewise, we want to follow that same in the second enlightenment, in the internal enlightenment. We want to follow the same process. We want to have an industrial revolution of harnessing energy for the creation of a better world, right? So, it's a fun analogy you can make. And so to do that, one of the things we're seeing is that this human interest, human motivation coheres as one of these value polarities, such that we start with self-interest, right? So according to evolutionary psychology, the only kind of interest is self-interest, right? That ultimately, the interest of the genes for the propagation of the species is what's motivating and tricking us into thinking that we have personal interests. We're just slaves to our genes, our selfish genes, as Dawkins would put it, right? And then that's been theorized by a variety of psychological theories, all of which are very muddled. So if you Google motivation, right, you'll see that there's some academic theories of motivation, but even the people who are trying to summarize it will admit that this is a kind of wild and woolly area of psychology, that even within human personal psychology, there's a bunch of different explanations. All of them have a piece of the truth, but there's no overarching theory of self-interest or human motivation. My favorite is Maslow's hierarchy, which I also mentioned, right? So that we've got self-interest, and your first level of self-interest is survival, right? And then sociability, and you build to, this idea of self-actualization. And Maslow, towards the end of his life, came to see that self-actualization in some ways was a mistaken idea, because if you have a self-interest in self-actualization, the truth about self-actualization is the only way you can be self-actualized is by serving something greater than yourself, by connecting to a kind of interest that transcends self-interest. So he tried to remedy this by just adding a layer on top of self-actualization, which he called self-transcendence. And then Viktor Frankl, another psychological theorist, he built on Maslow, or commented on Maslow, by saying, look, if you try to pursue self-actualization, you're never going to get there. It's like happiness, right? It's a byproduct of something else. And so this idea of self-transcendence within the psychological theorizing became another kind of interest, a greater than self-interest, an interest in something that's truly transcendent, not just self, but transcendent with a capital T in terms of, the direction of evolution, or the beautiful, the true, and the good. That there was this sort of recognition that self-actualization bled over into self-transcendence. But the idea that we're still in a linear hierarchy, and this is just another layer slapped on the top, I think is theoretically problematic, because people who are still hungry still want to give their gift to the world, right? You don't have to go all the way up the hierarchy of needs, although, it helps if the other needs are taken care of. So I began to recognize that the self-interest is a kind of value creating process, or a drive that we all need to care about. And that if we neglect our self-interest completely, then that's going to lead to pathology. And in this theory of polarities, we can see that greater than self-interest is another vital kind of interest that many humans exhibit, a motivation toward. But that ultimately, if you just become so fanatical in your pursuit of a given kind of greater than self-interest, neglecting your self-interest, it's not sustainable, right? So we began to see that self-interest and greater than self-interest they cohered in the kind of interdependent polarity that, I talk about here and unpacked and introduced in the book. And what makes that interesting is that not only is this polarity of self-interest and greater than self-interest evident in humans, most humans, it's also evident as a polarity at the intersubjective level of a culture, right? So we can analogize that self-interest and self-transcendence are what the individual is motivated by, by turns, and hopefully by both. And then we have society, what we might call human flourishing, is a kind of self-interest, of kind of grounded, materialistic, modernist idea of we want prosperity, we want freedom, we want a society where people are, it's working for them and they're taken care of, and these social problems of poverty and crime, et cetera, are largely, eliminated or on the way out. And that's certainly a worthy goal that has its own transcendent elements, kind of, just a functional, happy society. But ultimately, in the same way that self-interest ultimately requires this idea of greater than self-interest, human flourishing or just kind of material prosperity also is related to this idea of what we might call cultural transcendence, right? So this is even in the Bible, right? Where there is no vision, the people perish, right? This is something that's been understood for 1,000 years. This idea of that there's something higher for all of us collectively, not just individually. And this is where the idea of political will comes in, because the extent to which this something higher can connect in the polarity to human flourishing, then we were making progress, and our society can become fulfilling for us, that our individual needs for greater than self-interest become connected to the larger society's needs for what the next step of cultural flourishing could be for us, right? The achievement of the good life for all of us together. And, we come to realize that none of us can be fully self-actualized until all of us are in the process of self-actualization. So this connection between individual psychology and this larger domain, this under-theorized domain of political will, starts to we're starting to shed light on it when we understand that there are these twin, motivations for some kind of cultural transcendence, however the society defines that, the worldview defines that, and this idea of just having food and shelter and status and material and the things that we want, that we might say, like in Denmark, right? They have good human flourishing, right? People are generally wealthy. There's not a lot of poverty. There's not a lot of crime, although they haven't gotten rid of it entirely. Many political theorists, like Francis Fukuyama, point to Denmark as, in some ways the most advanced country in the world in terms of human flourishing. But that human flourishing, that self side of the polarity, ultimately begins to wither, and people start to want to break it apart if there's not a sufficient idea of what the transcendent means for us collectively, right? And so this is something that the eminent philosopher Charles Taylor has written a lot about in his book, The Secular Age. That book he talks about the horizon of transcendence and how every society needs to have some kind of connection to some vision of greater cultural transcendence, greater than, something that the culture can become that it's not now, right? Some direction of evolution that we can aspire to, a better world the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, as Eisenstein puts it, right? So that sense of cultural transcendence is extremely important, because human flourishing isn't just freestanding, it becomes bored. Just like your self-interest, if all you have is status and material, if all you care about is yourself, it's highly likely that you're going to become dissatisfied. You're going to, develop anomie or whatever you call it, right? You're going to become disillusioned because you need something bigger to keep on self-actualizing, and the same comes for this political will.
Yeah, so, I definitely think there's a pattern of transcendence at every level and in each of the zones, right? So I tend to think about it in terms of the coordination of the subsystems that are enlivened to create something that's more than the sum of their parts, which can then reflect back upon them. And whether that's a creating or a discovering is an open question, but that can happen within people. It can also happen among people. And I think it's, unless we get those lined up, unless this activity of accessing the more than the sum of the parts is operative all around the game board, people begin to wither. I really like this idea of polarity theory. It's very intriguing. I have sort of evolutionary vision in my mind of, people are generating these different crystallizations of their value experience. And over time, these are generalized, and these can try to couple with each other to some degree. Some of those couplings will be more stable than others, and some of them will be more adaptive than others. So a good adaptive coupling between one or a couple of values can go forward. I don't know if it's only two. Maybe there'll be situations where 3 or 4 of them could get together. We don't really know. But I think what that does is their resonance produces something that is more than just the 2 of them. And that more is an inherently developmental direction. It moves toward an increase of the value experience. So I'm on board with that. And one of the things that really interests me about that is the idea of virtuous practices which involve multiple paired values, right? So an example of that would be something like trying to do things you're not good at, right? This is sort of the objective of the growth mindset book, right? Because when you try to do something you're not good at, you get both self-esteem and humility, right? As a sort of reciprocally coupled set of values. But it comes almost automatically out of a certain kind of practice. And we could say that it's virtuous to perform those practices. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's a very, certainly, the idea of self-confidence and humility is another, I think, value polarity that your self-confidence requires humility for it to keep going. And your humility requires self-confidence so you don't get completely discouraged. I think this idea of coupling natural value pairs as an element of a virtues practice, that when the pairs are coupled, soul building takes place, right? The evolution of consciousness ensues. I think it's an intriguing idea. It isn't something that I've explored theoretically, but I'd love to explore that theoretically with you both offline and perhaps in another podcast. Virtues is a subject that I bring in chapter 8 of the book, but that's a woolly subject which, I don't want to address here and now. But I love that idea. So let's talk about that some more when I've had a chance to think about it.
Okay.
Okay, so this moves to the number 4 of my heading here, which is that each one of these worldviews, the traditionalism, modernism, and postmodernism or progressivism, each is its own channel or structural encircuiting or kind of a circuit for the upward current of the good at a particular level of development. And so here, let me pull back for a minute and define what I mean by transcendence. We've been throwing around this term, right? Self-transcendence and cultural transcendence. And in the book, and more generally in a variety of philosophical schools at the moment, the word transcendence with a capital T is being used as an umbrella term which can encompass whatever people can connect with that they feel an authentic greater than self-interest. Right? So so overcoming racism is a higher purpose, a transcendent goal. Or, feeding the hungry is a transcendent goal. Or achieving cultural evolution in a meaningful way is a transcendent goal. So transcendence, it can mean something that's spiritual, even supernatural, or it can be very secular, very kind of grounded in the physical. But it's about making things better in a way that can self-actualize you, but not just for you, but for others and for the world. So recognizing that everybody feels called by a version of transcendence, and that the more we can make transcendence accessible and useful, and the more we can connect it to self-interest, the more we'll channel this upward current for making the world a better place and solving our problems, which in some ways are getting worse and in some ways getting better. And so each one of these worldviews, both in its emergent phase in history and continuing in its currently, for the most part, transcended phase, has as its own definition of the good life. And one way that's been talked about in political philosophy is this idea of the American dream, right? So traditionalism has its own version of the American dream that's translated within the horizon of improvement that traditional religious worldview frames. And that is, we see it in American politics as America as a moral example of the world, right? Like as Ronald Reagan put it, quoting the Pilgrim, forget his name, but this idea of America as a city on the hill, right, from the Bible. Reagan called it a shining city on a hill, which is a rhetorical explanation of what a traditional sense of transcendence for America is about. That we represent democracy, that the land of the free and the home of the brave, and all these patriotic notions which progressivism tries to attack and falsify. But nevertheless, this has been part of America from the beginning, even though it hasn't been the primary American dream. It's been a supplement to the American dream. It's sort of the more moral component, the more selfless component of the American dream, is that we want to create a country that becomes a beacon of freedom and liberty for the rest of the world, a model, a successful model that others can emulate. And this was, for example, Lincoln drew on this image quite a bit in his trying to motivate people for the higher cause, the transcendent element of preserving the Union. It wasn't just preserving the Union for the self-interest of the nation. It was preserving the Union for the sake of this demonstration to the rest of the world that a free people in a democratic society can survive, that we're not going to just tear ourselves apart inevitably, that democracy can endure through centuries. And despite our political turmoil of the moment, I think Lincoln was right, that America has certainly had many crimes, many misdemeanors, many things that progressivism rightly critiques America for, right? Certainly slavery and the genocide of the Indians, horrific crimes of America, which fly in the face and in some way, for some people's minds, invalidate traditionalism's moral vision of the American dream. But I don't think that we can completely extinguish that, because we have to value democracy. I don't think we want to think about America as a model for the rest of the world, or a democratic country as a model. But I think perhaps we can agree that China, as an authoritarian state, a direction for evolution for them is to move into democracy, to adopt liberal values, that the emergence of modernity's freedoms is an authentic advance. And even though the Chinese people may be the majority may be satisfied with a surveillance state because it helps keep down crime or, keeps people in line, I think that eventually the structure of history, I still firmly believe that liberal values and democracy and modernity is an authentic direction of evolution, and that China has to go there or they're going to regress. They have to find that current of transcendence. So traditionalism, it's its own channel for this upward current of the good. And while there are plenty of eddies and plenty of pathologies that go with the ideal of cultural transcendence as defined by traditionalism in the Western world, I think those are still valid and need to be integrated and carried forward, right? Then we have modernity, right? Modernism, emerging during the Enlightenment, as I mentioned, this individualistic worldview. Its version of the American dream, has always been unabashedly getting rich, right? Becoming prosperous, lifting yourself out of poverty. And we're taken care of. We have maybe we'd like to be more wealthy, but I'm not pursuing wealth at the moment. We've sort of outgrown that. But for somebody who's lived in poverty and grew up, in a dirt floor barefoot, the idea of having an air conditioner and a nice car, living in a beautiful middle-class home, that's an authentic form of transcendence, right? That it's a transcendence as a going beyond, and going beyond the impoverished conditions of the developing world and moving into a life of material prosperity, at least temporarily. That is an authentic American dream, an authentic form of transcendence, creating a middle-class society where maybe not everybody, but the majority have their needs taken care of, and that they're compared to the aristocracy of the Middle Ages, they're more wealthy than they are in concrete material terms. So the American dream, because America was founded as a modernist country primarily, even though the majority of the people were still in a traditional center of gravity, this American dream of becoming wealthy and prosperous, and it's not just crassly about getting rich. It also involves achieving things, right? Like making a scientific achievement or an academic achievement or some social achievement. The American dream, as defined by modernity, is not just it's a straw man to think of it as just it's a sort of a greedy pursuit of wealth. Because there's some beautiful things about that too, and we can take that for granted because we already have what we need materially. For those who are deprived of basic material necessities, that American dream was a potent vision for cultural transcendence that powered American politics and culture for much of its century, much of its history. But then, of course, we see the emergence of progressivism, and progressivism emerges out of primarily the middle-class youth of post-war America and Canada and other places in the developed world, where all the gifts of modernity are already had, right? For the most part, the children, the baby boomers, that the American dream had already been achieved. And so just like, an individual person, when they get wealthy, but their life is not meaningful, wants something more, collectively as a generation, the baby boomer kids who brought in the 60s, sort of the cultural revolution of the 60s, were seeking a new horizon of transcendence, right? A new worldview that would define a new American dream. I mean, it's kind of a misnomer to talk about it as an American dream because it's transnational, right? It's no longer contained within America. Indeed, it's about a global planetary healing that transcends the pathologies of nationhood altogether, right? And that's a complicated element of it. But the idea that each one of these worldviews has their own version of this cultural transcendence or a dream of a better world, right? To unpack progressivisms a little bit, I mentioned at the beginning, the three ways it wants to see the world made better is by bringing about greater racial equality, better gender equality, and better environmental sustainability. And those sacred causes are largely defined by the negative externalities that have come about in the wake of modernity. And one of the things that I like to emphasize is that people who are versed in spiral dynamics thinking, which certainly has its merits, tend to think of these stages like steps. Okay, well, there's the blue meme and the orange meme and the green meme, and that these are just steps that we go through. And I think that because that's primarily psychologically focused, even though it claims to be biopsychosocial, ultimately, it's a psychological theory for the most part, and most people think of it in terms of where you are at in your center of gravity psychologically. But I think what that structure misses by making all these steps kind of seemingly equal steps on this spiral of development is that modernity is much bigger and in some ways more historically significant, I argue, than these other steps are. So the traditional worldview emerges with writing, right, 5,000 years ago. Maybe even longer, but certainly by the time of the ancient Egyptians, we can see architecture, mathematics, religion. We can see there's a king, there's a priesthood, there's a peasantry. These structures these sort of pseudo-feudal structures of traditional political organization are evident beginning in the ancient world, and that traditional worldview and its technology and its form of political organization continues with very little change throughout until the Middle Ages, right? I mean, they may have a Gothic arch and they may have certain technological advances, but the civilization is still at the same basic level that it had been for thousands of years. And then we have the emergence of modernity, which a lot of people describe that as, well, it was the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the steam engine and the harnessing of economic power. And certainly that was part of it. But as I argue in the book, it was really the emergence of liberal values, this recognition of the sovereignty of the individual, which was the main intersubjective power of modernity. And what I would say that the economic progress and the scientific progress and the democratic progress in politics stemmed from that essential emergence of liberal values as this sort of new level of the structure of emergence. And that this emergence is it's like the Cambrian explosion in cultural evolution. That modernity has created more cultural evolution than any worldview before or since. And that just like, that we can see the main innovation of the Cambrian explosion in biology was the vertebrate, right, or the backbone, we can make an analogy to the emergence of our political backbone as individual voters and citizens with modernity, right? Liberal values, they instill in us a sense of citizenship that people at the traditional level don't have, or at least have in a very dim way, right? They may be loyal to the king and have a sense of their kingdom, but they're not individuals in the same way that they are once modernist consciousness emerges within their psychology and the cultural effects of that consciousness begin to unfold. So modernity is something that we need to recognize as a major achievement, like the backbone. We're not going to go backwards, right? All further political evolution is built upon this idea that individual citizens have individual rights, and that those rights are protected by the rule of law, right? These are such basic things we take them for granted. But unless we're continuously valuing these things within this larger structure, even as we move to progressive and post-progressive conceptions of culture and consciousness, we still need the backbone, because, even though we may have primitive vertebrates, if we're going to get to humanity, if we're going to get to primates, then we're going to need this key innovation that allows us to stand up and be political actors and take control of political history, right? So I just want to put in an important plug for the preservation of modernity and how progressivism doesn't appreciate modernity appropriately for evolutionarily understandable reasons, right? It's breaking out of modernity's pathologies with the antithesis, but that same danger that goes with the misunderstanding of how important modernity is and how everything is building on it, that's a key blind spot or pathology of progressivism that we can push off against to create the next stage.
Well, I've got a couple of questions on all of that.
I'm talking a mile.
One is,
let me shut
up. My first question is, I noticed that in your list of the sort of three major insights or moral concerns of progressivism, you don't have one that's about economic justice and economic restructuring. How important do you think that is?
Certainly one of the major sacred causes. I mean, it's been a sacred cause that animated the early, Karl Marx and Charles Dickens. They saw the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, and they made class consciousness and upward mobility and the elimination of poverty and exploitation. That was one of the initial negative externalities of modernity that motivated the early those who tried to see beyond modernity, even though progressivism didn't emerge as a freestanding worldview of its own until the 60s, right? So Marxists were still within the culture of modernity, even though they were contrarians, right, within modernity. Certainly economic justice, you could say, is underlying racial justice and sexual justice. That environmental justice, sort of, there's some tension there, because if we want prosperity, then that's going to drive environmental degradation, at least within our current system. Clearly, progressives want to see economic justice without environmental degradation. So I agree that certainly economic justice is one of the sacred causes, but at the moment it's kind of subordinated, right? So they talk about it, but there have been attempts to try to substitute the move for racial equality, like in affirmative action, right? Instead of trying to elevate people by the color of their skin, we should elevate them by their socioeconomic status, because many of the people who are most successful under affirmative actions for skin color are already, coming from prosperous homes who've had SAT, coaching and everything else, right? So there's some tension there between those sacred causes within modernity, but you're right to point out that is a fourth that I should probably mention along with the other three, although in some ways it's been superseded by these others or overshadowed by the urgency by which progressivism is paying attention to these other sacred causes.
Now, I know that there are people who say that's partly strategic, which is that people who are invested in the modernity's idea of how to run the economy have a motivation, conscious or subliminal, to drive the discussion towards other value concerns rather than the economic structures. But I want to get away from that for a second, because my second question on what you've been previously saying is something like, okay, we've got a modernity, particularly the American version, that's exhibiting a lot of disorganization. It's almost like the parts of modernity are fighting each other, right? Is it individual rights versus the police, or the president versus truth, or corporations versus, media access? All the kind of values of modernity seem disorganized and as if they're competing with each other. And that shakeup seems to revive a whole bunch of traditionalists' hope that they can take the system back. But I'm looking at that, say, disorganized state of modernity. And what's the cause of that? Like, on the one hand, we could say the introduction of progressivism has destabilized the relationship between modernity and traditionalism. On the other hand, we could say that modernity contains an element that's inherently destabilizing, because its competitive individualism will eventually lead people to use schemes to sabotage the rest of the system. And progressives are only pointing that out and saying that we've got to fix that the progressives are the champions of the liberal values, and modernity always will self-disorganize if left alone long enough. So what do you think about those two?
Well, I think that every one of these worldviews has within itself not only the potential for pathology, but the constant growth of the inherent pathology that goes with its partiality, right? Because every worldview is partial, every worldview is unstable, right? Every worldview is in some ways unsustainable. Certainly modernity is unsustainable as a fossil fuel burning energy economy, or as a sprawl creating growth engine, that can wipe out every, nature and traditional cultures. And so there's plenty of reasons to be down on modernity, right? Or to focus on its negative externalities, as we've discussed. But I also think that part of the reason that modernity is confused and destabilized is because it's been, as progressivism has now all the, the sort of the good and the smart people in the culture, at least many of them, as they like to think of themselves, have made common cause with progressive values, at least a kind of a blurry, gauzy version of it. They don't want to look too closely, right? Because when they look too closely, there's identity politics, and that pours acid on everything that's come before in certain ways, right? So because modernity is under fire, and because the antithesis has effectively emphasized its negatives, right? I mean, in other words, anti-modernism and reverse patriotism are one of the results of progressivism's rise. And again, that's evolutionarily appropriate, because they're achieving escape velocity from this monolithic culture of traditional modernism, right? But because, progressivism is ascendant, progressivism is morally shiny and inspiring in many ways, and indeed it is. But because it's got this, antithetical relationship toward modernity, modernists haven't gained their feet yet, right? They haven't said, okay, enough of the antithesis. We need to revalorize modernity and stand up for liberal values. And there are certainly many intelligent voices who are kind of on the right side of the political spectrum who are trying to do that, not just libertarians. But even traditionalists have sort of seen an opportunity to attack modernity, like Patrick Deneen and Rod Dreher, and many of the traditionalists who are sort of dogpiling on postmodernity's critique of modernity, right? So modernism is getting it from both sides, at least intellectually at the moment. And I think modernity is robust enough, at least the liberal values there, that those will eventually be stabilized and reclaimed. But they're being challenged for both good and bad at the moment. And that's creating confusion, and it's creating this lack of purchase, that is many, because this paucity of political philosophy that can describe where we are and what's going on in these larger currents. Many people who still have a center of gravity of modernists, but who have an allegiance to progressivism, they're sort of confused about modernity. They're in a kind of a schizophrenic relationship to it, because they can't embrace progressivism fully, but they can't defend modernity adequately, because they have no defenses against progressivism's critiques. They haven't developed the challenge and support relationship in a healthy way that can preserve the good of modernity even while we prune away the bad. Right? So that's the historical process that we're in. And, the extent that, for example, racial equality is a sacred cause that I certainly support and, want to work toward and want to be in solidarity with. But, the intense tribalism of identity politics that erases those liberal values of the universal person and the sort of the rights of individuals and thinking about people as individuals rather than groups, that represents an existential threat to the best parts of modernity, which is why many people are beginning to recognize that, whoa, we want to side with racial equality, but we don't necessarily want to side with the founders of the Black Lives Matter organization, because given the chance, they would create the French Revolution and get out the guillotine and, chop all our heads off. So, we're in this situation where people are pulled to take sides, either to be against progressivism, to condemn it, right? To sort of, oh my God, to look at the threats of identity politics and say that's going to wipe out all of our important achievements, or they're pulled in a way that they're just in solidarity with it. And they just, like all these corporations have these, statements like Amazon, we're with the protesters. I mean, and that's good at a superficial level, but in reality, there's something subversive, about Amazon, this sort of paragon of modernity, pretending to be, with progressivism, because they're not acknowledging that progressivism is entirely subversive to Amazon as a company, right? As a capitalist, juggernaut of growth. So, people are pulled. They think that there's only two sides. You're either with the progressives or against the progressives. You're either an anti-racist, as that's defined by critical race theory, or you're a racist. And it's a very confusing time for people because they feel like those are their only two choices. And that is a problematic life condition that is extremely stimulative of, yeasty for the emergence of the post-progressive worldview, which you and I are in varying degrees, about.
So there's two ways from the post-progressive view, from the meta-progressive view, to think about the relationship between values and levels, let's say, right? One of them is to think about each of these historically developed cultural operating systems as bringing forth some primary values that then all have to be integrated, right? And so in your books, you have the diagrams where you're getting all the heritage values and the liberty values and the care values, as if these were particular values particularly associated with these systems. And from the post-progressive view, we want to get these systems all hooked up together. We want to make some kind of progress that involves all of these values. It's as if
yes, but it's not a kludging together of just both and. We're preserving the tension.
Exactly.
Challenge and support.
Sort of laid out horizontally, so to speak.
Okay.
Right? Now, the other way is to say all of the values, or maybe even something like all of Thomas Haight's moral instincts, they're all present at each of those levels, and that each level is only healthy and stable in the degree to which it can bring forth all of them. And so then the problem is not necessarily that the progressives need to be integrated with the values from the other stage, but that they need to bring forth and stabilize their version of all those values and not just their version of some of those values. So you see what I mean? Like,
I think that's
all four can go through the levels, or all four could be considered to be products of the levels. How do you follow that?
Well, that's a really excellent insight, and I think that just elaborates on my theory, our theory, because it's self-similar. Right? Not only do we want to create a synthesis that pulls together all these freestanding values into something higher, but we also want to make sure that each one of these levels is integrating all versions of the values. So it's both across the levels and within the levels, right? So certainly progressivism needs its own version of heritage values and liberty values and fairness values to be integrated with its caring values. And to the extent that it participated in the synthesis, it would be doing that.
Do you think it becomes more attractive to people at the other stages when it does that?
Absolutely. But at the same time, it still has to maintain a version of itself, right? Like we can't imagine Bernie Sanders getting too excited about mom and apple pie, right? Because very much of his values, are against heritage values and against the pathologies of heritage values. So, as Clara Graves says, people have a right to be who they are. That the people who are traditionalists, at least in our lifetime, they're going to continue to be traditionalists. And the people who are progressives are likely to, that it's good that they're in this culture war, because that's what's creating, that's what's creating evolution, right? Differentiation followed by integration. The integration may happen, in the next decade or so, or it may not happen until the next century. Maybe we need to collapse back and then try again. I don't have any special knowledge about what's our prophecy for history, but we can certainly tell which way is up. And which way is up is a world that works for everyone. And that means, I would argue, that every one of these, the positives of every one of these worldviews, not only become better integrated within each, but that they're synthesized at a higher level. And that involves a continuous process of pruning away the negatives of each, because as long as there's the positives of each, those negatives are going to keep coming up. They're intrinsically part of it. The fact that all these values represent light, meaning that they all cast a shadow. And so the constant dealing with those shadow elements at all these different levels is an ongoing process. That's how we are generating value, is partially is continually pruning away the shadows. So again, that's highly abstract, but it leads to my fifth and final segment, which flows right into your excellent question about how progressivism needs to bring liberty values into itself. Whether it can do that, right, without breaking out of its own container, right? I mean, in other words, the more liberty values and the more heritage values, the more these values get brought into this progressive worldview, the membrane, the horizon of improvement that is defined by the progressive postmodern worldview can't contain all those values. It bursts the membrane into something bigger, right? So that's its own question and its own, podcast perhaps. But in the book, to finish chapter 7, to bring it home, I said, okay, well, if every one of these worldviews has their own version of the American dream, right, with progressivism being planetary healing, and all the things that entail with that, its dream, what's the dream of this emerging post-progressive or integral or post-postmodern, meta-modern? There's lots of competing labels. What's its dream? What's its new horizon of improvement? And I would say that that's the recognition of cultural evolution on every front of its development as a societal project. That this cultural transcendence, right? Something that's higher for all of us collectively, can be found in this recognition that on this planet, the noosphere is evolving. And it doesn't evolve inexorably by itself. It's not some mechanical turn crank, dialectical material process. It's getting better because humans are striving to make their world a better place, and they're succeeding and they're failing, and it's creating all the dynamics of cultural evolution. And if we can sort that out and recognize that this is a higher calling that we have to continue to evolve our culture, to understand how culture and consciousness evolves, to gain a deeper understanding of that can create a kind of second enlightenment, which we could characterize as this birth event, this origin event of this next great phase of human history. And so how, it's easy to say as a sort of idealistic, and in chapter 7, I try to, rhapsodize romantically about the vision of Teilhard de Chardin's movement toward the omega point and all that. But in practical terms, I present 3 different strategies for how we could approach cultural evolution as a practical political project, how we could cultivate it, right? We're not, there's certainly ham-handed attempts at social engineering. And I guess we could point to some successes for sort of, let's have a great society by giving out welfare checks, that kind of thing. There's certainly some good that goes with that. But I think the better understanding of cultural evolution is that we have to approach it we're engineering, but like we're gardening. We're gardening for emergence. The evolution of consciousness really only occurs in a sustainable way through gentle persuasion, so that people are coming to this on their own. They're not being forced or coerced or manipulated into it. And that the process is transparent. So these are all conditions that I argue are necessary to make the project of cultivating cultural evolution moral and sustainable and ethical. And so I outline 3 different ways that we can begin to think about cultivating cultural evolution, right? So just to tick those off, one is to make each worldview more evolved on its own terms. The second is to create movement up the spiral so that the general center of gravity keeps moving up, like the rabbit in the python, And then the third would be to build this major evolutionary worldview, this integral postmodern worldview, to give birth to that, to participate in its emergence. They're related, the overlap, but we can break them out into 3 distinct things. The The first one, or the third one, let's start backwards, building the integral worldview, right? You and I have been doing this for many years in our own way. It's still tiny, right? It still doesn't have, it's not visible on the horizon of history. But I have faith, I think you have faith, that is really what, some version of this, we may not have a clear vision of it now, but progressivism emerged, right? Modernity emerged. These are not, it's not just a seamless continuum of growth. There's clearly tension in the system. And so we can see, in the last 300 years, we have modernity. And then in the last 50 years, we have, progressivism. And that clearly this points to a sequence of emergence, that progressivism is not the end of history. And I hope that progressivism won't wipe out modernity and cause a massive regression to pre-traditional, right? Or, some collapse of civilization, although some progressives might relish the prospect. I do think that there's something that comes after progressivism. What that looks like, we're still in the process of feeling our way into, but it's got to be integral in some ways, right? That is the antithesis, which progressivism clearly is in the course of evolution followed by a synthesis. So we can hope for a synthesis of some kind. We want to work to build that. There's a variety of ways to build that, but we have an opportunity now like never before, because Trump has accelerated history by, exacerbating the emergence of progressivism. Progressivism is gaining more traction more rapidly than it's gained in a long time, maybe since the 60s. It's a righteous expression of the sacred causes of progressivism that the society's really buying into and affirming, and all this is very good. But it also exposes the pathologies of progressivism. They're more threatening than ever before, right? The cultural threat to the other worldviews that progressivism represents is now more threatening and dire if you're not a progressive than ever before. But progressives can't see really the cultural threat that they represent. It's hard because they're embedded in their own worldview. They can't see its downsides. And this is a golden opportunity, in the short term and hopefully in the long term, for us to make hay in suggesting that there's something beyond progressivism that doesn't cause you to choose sides. You can transcend progressivism pathologies and reject, the negatives of identity politics without having to move to the right, right? So the paper that I just wrote, the article I just wrote in Aereo magazine about, it's called Toward a Post-Progressive Political Perspective. The original title I wanted them to use was How to Overcome Progressivism's Pathologies Without Moving to the Right. But that was kind of long and bloated for a title, so they chose the shorter one. But clearly, I do not want to see a regression. I do not want, I'm not a proponent of Republican politics. I think Trump is abhorrent. And so I want to see progressivism succeed, but I also see that the negatives of progressivism, as they're becoming more evident, are more threatening than ever before, which is pushing us in evolution to try to stake out this new ground, right? There's a new opportunity to make it real like we've never had before. The joke we've always said is that, that this integral perspective is a solution to a problem that people don't know they have, right? The idea that you need to evolve your consciousness or this new worldview, that's not attractive. And that's part of the reason why our numbers are so small. But now that progressivism's threats are more evident, at least to many, then now we have a problem for which we offer a unique answer. Because the answer doesn't mean voting for Trump, heaven forbid. The answer doesn't mean a revival of the right. The answer means going beyond progressivism by transcending and including it, by transcending its bad parts and including its best parts. And that's what this post-progressive framing is all about. And so so that we want to build the integral worldview. We want to help move people up the spiral, and we see that occurring naturally through education, right? It's a familiar feature of American life. People grow up in a fundamentalist evangelical household. They go to college. They either become modernists or now more than ever they become progressives. And so the natural institutions of the mainstream society are invested in causing movement up the spiral. But as things get clogged up, then that can cause movement down the spiral, which Trump represents. So there's all this kind of dynamic going on. And just by seeing it more clearly through this political philosophy that shows us these worldviews and these currents of transcendence that motivate these worldviews and cause them to come into conflict, That can help us be more skillful in cultivating emergence and movement, both in building the new worldview and in achieving movement up the spiral. So I just want to finish with this third element, or what I would list as the first one, which is kind of new to integral philosophy, and this idea that regardless of people moving from traditionalism to modernism, from modernism to progressivism and beyond, there's also a way in which we can cultivate cultural evolution by making each worldview more evolved on its own terms, right? So again, to touch back on Graves' insight that people have a right to be who they are. And then they're going to be that way for our lifetimes at least, right? So traditionalism can become more evolved without people moving to modernity by integrating, by using this process of values integration to enter into a relationship of challenge and support, so that the negatives of traditionalism, that we're never going to get rid of the negatives of traditionalism, racism, sexism, homophobia, right, authoritarianism, but those are never going to be completely eliminated from society until traditionalists themselves will no longer tolerate them. And traditionalists don't really see them as a threat, or they're not as bothered by them because they're not challenged adequately. And the reason that they're not challenged adequately is because they're in a defensive posture. They're in a defensive crouch, understandably. But if we allow for a relationship of challenge and support, so that we can say, look, we can allow for the legitimacy and the freestanding, existence of traditional values, as long as you traditionalists are willing to take responsibility for the negatives of ethnocentrism and start to deal with racism among your own families and within your own culture, right? And so traditionalism can evolve, and people could still be traditionalists, but more evolved traditionalists. And this can occur through this polarity interaction. Same way with modernity, right? Modernists can continue to be modernists. They can continue to hold those liberal values and those achievement, progress values when they're better able to recognize the negative externalities that are threatening the planet as a whole, right? That is, we're never going to get rid of the modernity's environmental degradation until modernists themselves will no longer tolerate it, right? Same thing can say for progressivism can emerge on its own terms without becoming integral if it can begin to create social norms within its own discourse that acknowledge that these are real negatives that progressivism brings that thwarts its own political goals, right? There's so many, identity politics, in some ways, it shoots in the foot the higher goal of racial equality because it creates all this backlash and it erodes the liberal values upon which progressive values ultimately depend. So, when we see this as an ecosystem and we see the interdependence of the system, not just within the polarities themselves, but across the system as a whole, we can begin to think about cultural evolution as a project. Part of the reason that cultural evolution is not on the agenda politically is that most people don't have any idea of how it might be approached. They have just these vague notions how we're going to make the world a better place. But once we bring in the light and the power of the new truth, that consciousness and culture are evolving, and that there are structures, and that there's systems, and that there's metabolisms and forms of energy, then just like science gained hold of electricity and made this wonderful world of electronic technology, we can create a wonderful world of social technology, political technology that can overcome the turmoil that threatens to destroy our society.
Well, your third point I feel is very straightforward, at least for myself, right? Absolutely, we need some kind of meta progressive perspective, and it needs to gain ground. And we could conceive of that as something new and different, or we conceive of it as the health, balance, integration, and growing up of the progressive perspective. I think we're not quite sure where that is at the moment. Like, progressivism is so new, we don't know if we're seeing its real form or its baby form, right? That maybe its maturity is the integral universe, or maybe the integral universe is a leap beyond. But basically, those two options look almost identical to each other. So the urgency, the needs are the same. We have to get beyond the form of it that we have at the moment into something more balanced, more integrative, more energized, and more expansive. So I think that part's really good. Your first 2 points are really intriguing, and they dovetail together in a very interesting way, because when you think about what makes any given level a healthy example of that level, it's just humanly healthy. There's better or worse, more balanced, less balanced, right? There's a number of different things. We talked earlier about disorganization, right? As if the parts of that make that system work are fighting each other. then that's a problem at that level. There's also the notion that that level is failing to regenerate itself is a sign of its unhealth, right? Like, so one thing you could say is there's a lot of complaints about modernity's education system. And one of the problems might be that modernity is not really inculcating the skills that produce modernity. It's just teaching kids to know about the worldview and memorize the consensus facts produced by modernity, but it's not teaching them how to have the experiences and skills that regenerate modernity, and therefore modernity starts to fail over time. It starts to look like a traditionalist dogma because its self-regeneration system is too superficial. So, right, so you have to be organized at your level, you have to be able to regenerate your level, but you also have to have your level be open-ended, right? So I would say that's one of the signs of a healthy level is it's not sealed off. It's not capped. It's available for throughput to the next level.
Nice
so
point.
That's the part where I feel like I personally know the least, which is what makes a level available to become the next level when it wants to, and what makes it difficult for it to do that. What makes it suppress the development into the next level where that might naturally want to occur.
Sure. Well, like any system, I mean, so we have some theoretical tropes around this, although there's certainly a lot more to discover and understand. Part of this idea of the horizon of improvement, I mean, it creates a container. There's a limit, the power of limits, right? By limiting what we're talking about in terms of our American dream, we create something that people can grasp a hold of and conceive of and strive for. The goal becomes concrete enough that it provides a direction of advance, right? And so if the horizon if there's not a horizon, if there's no limits to what our definition of good life is, its value energy can't gain traction. The magnetism is reduced because there's not a positive negative pole circuit created, right? And so every worldview, of course, like any system, has antibodies to that which would disrupt the system or penetrate the membrane horizon of improvement. And so there's quite a bit of thinking in mainstream integral philosophy and spiral dynamics and other philosophical approaches to understanding these structures and how they relate to each other. But I think one of the firmest membrane defining conceptions that we can use is, again, the dialectical pattern of transcendence and inclusion. And it's not, in some ways there's a seamless continuum. And ideally, we want modernity to continue to develop on its own terms, as I just described. But eventually, that development breaks out of it. The horizon of improvement can no longer hold it. Modernity can no longer define within its confines the cultural transcendence that we're beginning to envision. The horizon gets bigger, our altitude gets higher, and we can see more of a horizon, right? So, I think that the whole thing can be raised with these levels still intact, but I think there's other ways in which, as we build this higher synthetic level, that these other levels are going to exist in a transcended form. So tribalism as a worldview, an earlier worldview structure, exists as children grow up, right? They go through the magical phase. It exists in a romanticized, so progressivism loves tribal culture, tribal aesthetics. But because, there's no longer, the threats of tribalism, right? The oppression and the violence and the ignorance and the superstition and all the craziness that goes with tribalism, that's so far removed that those negatives are no longer a problem. They're no longer, on the table for the most part. And so we can just have all the beautiful parts of tribalism, free, without having to prune away or having to wrestle in a polarity. It's just like something that's transcended and that we can appreciate going forward, and maybe revitalize and touch back to occasionally in our history. And likewise, traditionalism, I think, will one day be seen like tribalism, some beautiful thing that's been transcended but still in our DNA, in a way, our cultural DNA. And we can think about it romantically, like we now think about tribalism, without, with its gnarly pathologies kind of out of the picture. So we can speculate about the future, about how, as the spiral grows larger, as we get to, post-progressive and post-progressive, and, obviously these stages of evolution will continue. But I think this relates back to what you said at the beginning about, is this next emergence a maturation of progressivism, or is it something that's post-progressive? And I think it's both. I think certainly progressivism can mature, but I also think there's something kind of, it's a little bit of placating to progressivism, just say that you represent, mature progressivism is equal to integralism, because of the character of progressivism, how it fits as a spiral. It's still, in the jargon, a first-tier meme. It still can't see its own pathologies. And just as it gained its traction in evolution by pushing off against the pathologies of modernity, part of the impetus for this next stage, part of it comes from pushing off against progressivism's pathologies, right? So there's a way in which we can feel the dialectic energy of transcendence. We need to transcend progressivism in order to better include modernity and traditionalism, that there is a dialectical separation in the offing, right? And that's why, in my theoretical construct, I see it as a stage beyond progressivism. But progressivism has the luxury of simply rejecting what came before in a straight. They just, piss on that shit. They don't like it. And that's sort of a righteousness. There's a righteousness to that, because those negative externalities are unsustainable, right? We are going to fry the planet if we don't reject modernity in a strong way. But we don't have the luxury of simply rejecting progressivism, right? If we do that, we're going to regress to Prager University, right? Or Jordan Peterson. We're not going to just reject it. We have to do the more tricky move of transcending and including. So instead of a still photo of, modernity bad, progressivism good, we have a moving picture. Progressivism incomplete, post-progressivism more complete, but still incomplete, right? There's something beyond it, but we have to kind of go back and forth. And to some, that might seem, mealy-mouthed or too relativistic. Like, how can you not, stand against the negatives of progressivism? Well, because we wouldn't be thinking about what comes after progressivism if progressivism hadn't succeeded, right? If we hadn't embodied those progressive values, we wouldn't be able to see what comes next. So I do think that a maturation of progressivism is part of evolution, but I also think we need another dialectical step, and that's why I'm talking about it in terms of post-progressive.
Well, here's an interesting thing for me, looking at progressivism from the meta-progressive perspective. Is it, too righteous or not aggressive enough? And what I mean there is, like, if you talk to people who were in the Sanders campaign, they're very divided on whether or not they were hard enough on Joe Biden, sort of the embodiment of modernity's interests at the moment, right? So one way, from the meta perspective, you say, well, maybe progressives and progressive propaganda, progressive political campaigns need to speak to a broader, more diverse population group by rephrasing themselves in a way that seems more compatible with a broader number of values. That's a strong argument. But there's another argument which says they haven't been aggressive enough, right? That they didn't go against Joe Biden hard enough and soon enough, that the machinery they're fighting largely only respects moves of force, not necessarily moves of inclusion. And when you say, look, why aren't you guys nicer and more like us and more inclusive and more modernist friendly? That could be a strategy on the part of modernism to undermine the progressives. Right? So there's a lot of people there saying the progressives haven't leaned in hard enough. They haven't been aggressive enough. They haven't been trying to use the actual levers of power hard enough. They've been content to try to put forward value statements. So what do you feel about that? Because both of those are very interesting options from the meta-progressive perspective.
Sure. Well, excellent frame. Every one of these worldviews have internal contradictions, right, and fights. And certainly does progressivism and in a microcosm Bernie Sanders campaign. And I think that they're both right, and they're both wrong. We could talk in general terms like that. But I think if we go back to what we talked about earlier, of every one of these worldviews acting as a channel for the upward current of the good, right? So the moral arc of history, right, progressivism very much wants to represent that and channel that and achieve that. And they want to do that by generating political will, right? By generating numbers, by generating money, by generating political power. And so the part of that debate is what's going to empower us? Are we going to be more empowered if we compromise with modernity, or compromising with modernity or trying to be friendly modernity is going to cut off the source of discontent, which is where the negative pole of our polarity that is driving our success, right? So we're succeeding in the sense that we're more powerful than ever before. There's millions of people on the street in solidarity with us. All of these major institutions of modernity are pledging allegiance to our cause. And so they're drunk with success in this moment to a degree. And part of that political will, they've tried to generate political will for climate change. It hasn't worked. The circuit didn't flow, right? The political will for gender equality flowed a little bit. But boy, they've struck a gusher with this racial equality current. And part of that is by emphasizing the negatives of racial oppression. So the video of George Floyd is this extremely powerful visual, symbolic expression of the horrors of racism in our face, and that's been a powerful. It's struck a nerve or tapped into a current, however you want to talk about it. So there's this powerful current going on that's empowering postmodernism, and it's based on the pointing out and the intolerance toward the evils of racism, which is a good thing. And so there's naturally strategists within this progressive postmodern political field that say, look, we got more of a jolt out of that than everything, so let's double down on our rejectionism, right? Our negativity, right? So the whole culture of Chaz, or CHAP, the Occupy of Capitol Hill in Seattle. I mean, if you just look at how that's being covered, they're very much in the fuck modernity, fuck America, you're now leaving America. And, they're emphasizing that because that's a powerful nerve that they've struck, and they're bringing a lot of people to their side by that. But of course, those who can feel the cultural threat of progressivism see that and see it as, a wonderful advertisement for the Trump campaign. Right? Because that's what if you want to embrace progressivism, that's what you get, right? Is you're going to get the Capitol Hill enclave, and that's what society is going to be like. And of course, that's not it. But you can see how that there's a strong argument for those who are making the argument that we should just criminalize modernity, right? That we should look at it as this monolithic, Manichaean, negative thing that we can only view as negative, and that any attempt at out-group reconciliation is in-group betrayal, right? And that's another dynamic of the first tier that I recommend that we need to overcome. Because, those who say that we should only, we shouldn't play fair or even play with modernity, that you're being a compromiser, that modernity is so insidious and they're so strategically manipulative that those who want to make common cause or create harmony, that they're dupes, right? That they're not realizing that this is entirely negative. Well, that's a delusion, right? That's clearly a pathology. That'll clearly destroy the rest of the civilization if it were to somehow gain power. And so there, the seeds of its own partiality are being writ large because there's no challenge and support. There's plenty of support, but no challenge. And that's why it's difficult for modernity to challenge progressivism, as we see Amazon, bending the knee, for example. And that's why, in order to reestablish a relationship of challenge and support that can make progressivism's contribution more healthy and not so destructive, creative destruction rather than destructive destruction, is to establish a challenge and support from the other side. Right, to create a challenge to progressivism that doesn't represent a regression or a movement to the right. And so, that's what the book's about.
There's a very interesting situation where some people will see traditionalism as the greatest threat to both progressive and liberal modernism. But other people who see modernity as the greatest threat because it has the most power and the most devious mechanisms, so to speak, that traditionalism would potentially be a better ally to the progressives in terms of establishing their power on the scene more thoroughly. And that's a very intriguing option. Because you've got, I mean, there's people like Sagar and Jetty who are basically progressives with a conservative slant. But when you think about whether you could get some kind of alliance between progressives and traditionalists to combat the overwhelming presence of modernity, it's hard to think about how that would actually work. You know, I grew up in a community that was a half hippie, half fishing and farming community, right? So the back to the land moment was a moment at which progressives and traditionalists had a lot in common in some contexts. Do you think there's a future for a progressive traditionalist alliance, or will that always fall apart and progressives have to mostly look to progressively aligned liberals as their allies?
Wow, well, that's a really insightful question, a really good question. I think we can see, I think the simple answer is not in the short term, because modernity is still in the way, right? Separating these two. They're still in competition, right? So for them to cooperate, there'd have to be a lot of different life conditions that we see now. And it can also be a disaster. So we see a little bit of that going on between traditional Islam and progressivism, right? If you watch Al Jazeera, you know, they have all these progressive tropes of attacking modernity, and you know, Islamic traditionalists have enlisted many of those critiques of modernity and adopted them, right? So there's this kind of, I'm not sure if it's a legitimate alliance, but at least there's been some opportunistic, right, appropriation on the part of militant Islamists of many of the progressive critiques of modernity, right? So now that modernity is been morally delegitimized by progressivism in the eyes of Islamic traditionalists, right? They can say, well, these guys, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So I'm the enemy of modernity, and here are these other people who are the enemy of it, even though I think, you know, if you ask me about their lifestyle or about their what they think, I'd say they were infidels and needed to be, you know, executed. But in terms of their critiques, those are useful weapons, which we're happy to grab and use to attack modernity. But that's not really what we're talking about here in terms of the America and Canada, traditionalism and progressivism becoming aligned. You know, I think it's an intriguing proposition. I think there's some opportunities there potentially, but I think that ultimate alliance would have to take place at a level of the synthesis where, you know, the tensions have been reduced and modernity has been given its due. So modernity is not just seen as erasing traditionalism or being the mortal enemy of modernity, but that all three have their positives and negatives. Then the affinities, the natural affinities between traditionalism and progressivism can be, you know, explored and they can take place once the war, if the culture war, has been brought to a level of peace. So until we can bring peace to the culture war, I don't see that as being anything but an occasional opportunistic trope.
Yeah, bringing peace to the culture war is a tricky thing, because on the one hand, you've got the sort of the grammar of how you would do that, right? You can say what we need are people who go, because the values of traditionalism and because the values of modernity, therefore progressivism, right? So that's a very tidy, but in a way very superficial approach, because it deals with the level of symbolic and linguistic call-outs to values. Now, definitely I would think that someone trying to galvanize political will has to speak in a way that's like that. But nonetheless, if we look at, you know, the substructures, the actual power mechanisms underlying each of the systems, we might have a different take on what has to be done to bring them together, aside from just being able to speak to those values and integrate them and align them in a forward direction. But I don't think there's any particular way we can get into that at the moment. We've been talking for a while, and I love it. I don't mind. But is there anything else you still want to mention off your list, or anything we've spoken about that you want to touch back on at this time?
Sure. No, this has been a full meal. Certainly, we've covered a lot of good ground. I mean, I really appreciate your willingness to get into some of the more philosophical elements of developmental politics. And, you know, I think that this is a good place to call it a complete podcast.
Okay. If anybody's listened this far.
yeah. If you're still awake.
Yeah. Just go back to the 10 times Steve said we should have a whole other podcast on this topic.
Well, and
maybe we'll get to those.
Should. Just because we're skimming over the surface of some things, and I just want to acknowledge that, boy, that's a big can of worms, and interested to unpack that. So pardon my repetition of that trope.
No, that's great. I mean, I look forward to unpacking all those things.
Great. I'll look forward to next time.
You, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Layman.